Welcome to AM Insider, a production of our own. In this podcast, we will have a series of informative discussions tackling the adoption of additive manufacturing, answering those burning questions and swapping experiences. Learn from experienced individuals on how innovation can push the boundaries of what is possible. Hey, and welcome to the podcast. My name is Justin Hopkins, and with me here as always is Dustin Klumpkin. Let's get inside AM. How are you doing today, Dustin?
I'm doing great, and I'm looking forward to this next discussion.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to episode 4. It's been a little while. We took a little bit of break. There was the holidays in between the last episode that we did, but I'm glad that we're back. And I'm going to have you talk a little bit about what the topic is today, because this is a topic that you brought up to our attention, and give us a little bit of background on it.
You know, a lot of the things that we want to talk about are things that I think you and I find interesting and that we might get questions on, either because we have our own questions or because other people are asking us questions. And something that comes up fairly frequently, especially at trade shows, I would say, is bioprinting. And a lot of people ask me, hey, what's the latest and greatest that's happening? What are the companies out there? How long is it going to take until I can, print a replacement organ, things like that. And so I reached out to one of my contacts here to see if he'd be willing to talk, and he did. So I'll be kind of curious to learn a little bit more about what he's been working on. And Justin, I'm sure you kind of get those kind of questions as well, right?
Absolutely. And actually, recently I just watched Dr. Death. I'm not sure if either of you guys are familiar with it, but the second season of that is actually about a doctor that was reprinting tracheas, right? And there wasn't a lot of background testing done.
I love Macaroni.
That's right.
Maybe 6 years ago, I wrote a paper for a bioethics course. Don't be like Paolo, and that was the concept of the paper. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's a good segue into introducing our guest today. So, Dustin, since you guys have a history, I'll let you do a little bit of introduction, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll let Mike introduce himself, but I'll just say I worked with him in a previous role, and I find him to be a very intelligent person from a lot of respects. And so I'm always excited and kind of waiting at the end of my seat when Michael has something to say, because it's usually pretty smart and something I probably haven't thought of before. So with that, Mike, maybe you want to give a little bit of your history and the kind of wild ride you've been on so far?
Justin, you flatter me. I'm blushing. Thank you. And thank you, Justin, also for inviting me to be here tonight. Me and Dustin met, it's got to be, 8 or 9 years ago now, initially in 3D printing. He was in an applications engineer role, was in tech support. Prior to that encounter, I had received a bachelor's degree in cell and molecular biology, but I took a pivot, got into 3D printing, where me and Dustin, but then ultimately I moved on from there, and we can talk about our time more there, Dustin, as we get into it. But then I went on to get my master's in stem cell biology at the University of Minnesota at their Stem Cell Institute. Specifically, I wanted to take what I had learned working in the 3D printing industry with my prior knowledge of cell and molecular biology and start using biomaterials and cells as our bioinks and our hydrogels, start working on biofabrication and 3D tissue models, working towards organogenesis. And that's the pathway I took. I never actually finished my master's in Minnesota because I moved on to my PhD in Ireland, in Dublin, Ireland. There was a lot of investment opportunities there, a lot of public-private partnerships going on. And as a relatively young, I'd never been to Europe, so I moved there to pursue my studies and continue bioprinting over there. And I'm really happy I did it. It was a lot of fun. I learned a lot of new techniques, new applications, met a lot of great scientists over there. And shortly after, I relocated back here to America, and this is where Dustin's reaching out and asking if we want to talk about bio on the podcast, which, as he knows, I'm always more than happy to talk about bioprinting if given the opportunity.
Great. Thank you for that intro. And, since kind of talking about both things here, and I know we haven't spoken that much for quite a while, you have a lot of experience with 3D printing, and now you have a lot of experience with bioprinting. For those listening in to learn that have the background of 3D printing, what would you say is like one of the biggest differences between how you approach 3D printing versus printing in cells?
So cells are high maintenance. They have a very thin criteria of what they like and a very broad criteria of what they don't like, mainly being temperature, pH, what physical pressures you're putting them on. When we look at thermopolymers and 3D printing, that's pretty straightforward. You send polymers through a hot glue gun and you push it through either pneumatically or mechanically with a screw or a drive motor, and it comes out at a fairly consistent rate. And a lot of these polymers and materials don't care what conditions you keep them at prior to, or to some extent after printing with them. The cells are, I like to say, high maintenance. They have a narrow temperature range you need to keep them through, relatively minimal forces you can exert on them compared to other materials you might be printing with. They're pH sensitive, they'll be light sensitive. I wouldn't recommend you cross-linking with live human cells or any type of mammalian cells. The UV light will cause damage to them. For that reason, we'll use blue light at 405 nanometers rather than a UV light, and we'll tailor our cross-linking chemistry within our biomaterials to feed off of that criteria that the cells essentially dictate. But there are a few different ones, mainly temperature, pH, physical forces would be the big ones, and we're normally confined by those. Time would be another big one. Again, using a thermopolymer, if I'm printing, when the print is done, my 3D object, for the most part, might require a little post-processing, but it's done, it's ready to go. When I'm using cells and bioprinting, there's much more of a 4D component where time is playing a role. Again, that's based off the cells needing time to differentiate, to divide, to multiply, fill in a cavity or a platform scaffold that you put them in.
Wow. Well, I really don't know anything about 4D printing. So,
I find that hard to believe, Dustin.
Fair point, but I feel like I really don't. But, given all that, would you say, and this is probably just showing my unknowing of the industry, would you say that 4D printing, the process, is maybe where 3D printing was 30 years ago, in that there's a lot more considerations and processes that you need to think about? I would imagine a lot of this stuff isn't super automated yet, but it's probably quickly catching up with a lot of the technology.
Yeah, it's a tough question to answer, but there's a few different parts, and especially when you're looking at biology and 4D print, 4D printing is almost a broad category on its own.
Yep.
Think of a lot of shape-changing materials would be classified into that. There's a few different ways to look at 4D printing. But as it pertains to biology and bioprinting, yeah, we'd be interested in the shape-changing materials. We're interested in, essentially, normally, the end goal is the physiology and what the cell ends up being, and therefore its form and function of what it's capable of doing. But to get there, we may take a few steps upstream and play with molecules and cell types that are, let's say, progenitor cells that then will seed into a scaffold. When I was doing my PhD, we had something and then I'd seed it with cells afterwards, but then I'd let it sit in an incubator for a month. I wouldn't even, I'd give it fresh nutrient media every 48 hours, but otherwise I wouldn't mess with it for a whole month. And then I would start to characterize it after a month went on. But there's shorter time frame applications too. If you're looking at a shape-changing chemistry, You may print something in a flat sheet like shape and then curl it afterwards to become tubular. And that may be, minutes after you print it, compared to me waiting a month before I look at something I actually printed.
Wow. I have so many questions. I mean, a lot, but I'm going to start with a more basic setting there. So for listeners, like we have different listeners that have different ranges of knowledge. And so you're referring to bioprinting. Can you kind of maybe walk us through like your background as far as the history of bioprinting, that your knowledge is of it? And then like what type of printing are you, I mean, you're saying bioprinting, but I want to relate that to like an FDM or like a powder-based machine. I'm assuming there's different types of bioprinting. Could you give a little bit of background on it?
Sure, but that answer could easily take an hour. So I'm going to cut a few corners there, because just like 3D printing is a term, and there's many different mechanisms of 3D printing: inkjet, droplet-based, FDM, laser sintering. There's different classifications of methods, and bioprinting would have the same architecture. Bioprinting is a term, and typically, well, let me start with that, saying there's different classes of bioprinting. And when I came from thermoprinting, like FDM, and I was very familiar with sending a material spool through a hot extruder and extruding material out, and to some extent bioprinting does work like that. I'd use a syringe. We'd have a syringe at 37 degrees Celsius with the hydrogel in there. And a hydrogel would be a biomaterial, normally collagen-based, very similar to the consistency of Jell-O, retains a lot of moisture. And that moisture, for a part, is to keep cells hydrated. Now, you could bioprint with a hydrogel with or without cells in it, and that will dictate some of the hardware that you can use. Because if there's not cells in there, I can put a lot more forces on that. I can use a wider temperature range. I could maybe make a architecture. I could 3D print it and then cross-link it with a UV light if I wanted to, prior to putting cells on there, because I don't have to worry about this UV light damaging the cell's DNA at that point. But I can also, if I wanted to, encapsulate cells in that hydrogel. Or we could be using, and hydrogels are normally organic in composition, but there's plenty of bioprinting that goes on with inorganic and synthetic materials as well. So it's really, I like to think of it as printing with biocompatible materials, because you're not always using cells in there. I do think as the folks who are printing with cells in their material are kind of hardcore bioprinters. But myself included, there'd be plenty of applications where you print with a biomaterial and then seed it with cells. And you would want to do that for a few different reasons. One of the main ones is a lot of these biomaterials are easier to manipulate when you don't have cells in them, because the cells have that tight criteria for temperature, pH, pressure, osmotic pressure ranges that you need to adhere to. If I take cells out of that equation, I can be more aggressive with the parameters that I'm printing with. And as I'm sure you folks know, that changing your printing parameters can have a drastic outcome on your resolution, your print quality at the end of the day. So that's a big part of it. I like to think of it as 3D printing with biocompatible materials, with or without cells. And then you have a few different ways to go about doing that. You could use a hydrogel in a syringe. You could use a hydrogel in an inkjet printer, piezoelectric ejector. Most way photoresins would behave. You can create a similar printing process. There are folks kind of the holographic printing where you'd have a vat of photoresin, and you're either spinning it or you're using multiple lasers to cross-link a biomaterial at a high rate of speed. But then those are typically limited to a homogeneous material type. Another perk of bioprinting or 3D printing with biological materials was multi-material printing and organizing of these different material types to create a specified pattern. Frequently in biology, you'll have different types of cells in close proximity to each other, and they may serve a different role, and they may have different mechanical properties. If you look at your bone and your knee cartilage, they're attached to each other, they're right next to each other. They're similar, but they also, one's more softer, they behave differently. The bone gets calcified. The cartilage shouldn't get calcified unless you're going through osteoarthritis. There's differences there as well. And that's to say that you might want to have like a cartilage biomaterial in one of your extrusion nozzles and an osteogenic bone hydrogel material in your other nozzle. You might want to have a third nozzle for removable support material that you can organize these architectures with and then dissolve away later, or just a different material type for a nearby tissue that you're trying to create a model with.
Wow. I don't know about you, Justin, but I now feel stupid.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's a lot to take in. I mean, it's like any avenue that you go down in the world of printing, whether it's 3D.
A loaded question. There's many different ways to go about 3D printing. Bioprinting would be no different. And we actually take advantage a lot of the same techniques. I mean, even the metal printers that you'd see different applications for, folks are using, I should say large companies are using metal printing in bone applications, bone grafts, titanium hip implants, a bunch of different applications where it's essentially 3D printing at that point, but then they're inserting it into the body and having cells engraft in it. And a lot of their surface topology, I love the folks over at Pen Topology and all the companies working on surface topology, and especially with the metal laser sintering, because how you change that surface topology, the cells, that makes a big difference on the cells, how they recognize that material. If they recognize it as a foreign object, and you'll get a fibrosis kind of scar tissue that forms around it, depending on how the cells perceive it. And that's, a smooth sheet of plastic versus a micro-etched metal, or even a smooth piece of metal, rather, and a micro-etched metal. Your cells will perceive that differently and behave differently just on that little characteristic. So plenty of different types of bioprinting, and they're all, to some extent, application driven. For a bone graft, those are orders of magnitude stiffer than other, a hydrogel for a pancreas. And pancreas is one of the softest organs you would have compared to the bone, which is merely one of the stiffest in your body.
So that's an interesting point, right? Because to me, being on the polymer side, and we also have metals, but I see, you mentioned like hip replacements or parts of bone graft, and I see it as just an application within metal printing. I never thought of it as it's bioprinting. So that's an interesting way to.
And the metal stuff I do see more as 3D printing, but they're implanting it in a biological environment like that. And there is a feedback loop, like the surface topology, they can tailor that to the way that the cells would prefer it. And they're getting good results doing that. It's just fixing to the surrounding tissue better, and they're getting less joints that are pulling out because of their topology and how the cells can engraft into that. And it's just more surface area for them to hold on to and anchor into.
So I'm going to dumb this conversation down just a little bit here, because I don't know who's all listening in, but and maybe you know something about this, but maybe you don't, Mike. But lately, a lot I've been reading about when it comes to this kind of stuff is printed meat, or printed steaks in particular.
I'm sure topic.
I've read a number of cases on it with some of these newer, we'll say, startups that are really trying to feed the world to some extent
Yeah,
without
it's a noble
creating.
cause.
Yeah.
I keep up on the industry. I went and had a job interview out in San Francisco maybe a year ago related to this. And essentially, I have respect for the industry. I think they're trying to do something noble. They're trying to, solve world hunger and,
Yep.
for, people shouldn't be hungry. I can get behind all that. But, I also think, wow, Monsanto probably said a lot of the same things when they're growing their big multinational business.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you got to watch out. And I look at it from a little skepticism because, I'm trying to think of a good way to say this. I would want to see how they're making it before I would want to eat it myself. I would be skeptical of it. But that's me as a personal thing. It's not like a rant against the whole industry, but it's pretty cool. And when I look at it from a medical perspective, we'd be doing a lot of similar applications. And I always, I would always think, oh, if I was going to 3D print a nice steak, how would I do it? And what type of, it's not all muscle cells, there's connective tissues that you would want to incorporate and the fat molecules and the adipocytes that create the fat molecules, that's where the flavor is, you got to work some of those in. And then the texture, if you don't have the right texture, yeah, some folks will eat it, but that's got to be bang on. And, but there's crossover with the medical applications because I worked a lot with the cartilage and how cartilage interfaces with bone and the mechanical properties of your cartilage tissue. It's a little squishy. It behaves as a shock absorber. And we would tailor our 3D printing to hit certain mechanical properties related to how squishy it is and to create like a good, let's just say making taco meat would be easier than creating an A5 Wagyu right off the bat. But there's definitely but I look, hey, like taco meat wouldn't be that hard to print or to create. And a lot of times it's almost like a bioreactor that they have to culture all these cells up, these different types, adipocyte, your sarcomeres for your muscles and your myocytes. But then it's just organizing them through a 3D printer. That's very similar to what we might do in a medical application too, to organize these cells. Because, if you were just to take all these random cells and throw them together by hand, in a beaker, let's say, they wouldn't form the right patterns and the texture would be off. It wouldn't be right. If you really want to make like a proper state tissue, you need to organize these. And even that would probably take a little time in an incubator to, those cells. If you just put the cells down, they need an extracellular matrix, their environment, and the cells secrete that. You can add some of those proteins into your biomaterial. Like we were using collagen and hyaluronic acid as a biomaterial to work with in the past. It's all protein, so it's a lot of the stuff's healthy to eat anyways, but some of your photo cross-linking molecules might not be as healthy. That would be a selection that you would have to look into. Essentially, you don't want to use any chemistry in your materials that would potentially harm someone who ingests your product. So that's a little different from the world that Dustin, you and I grew up in, where you were not supposed to ingest some of these materials we were printing with.
Yeah.
So on the topic of materials, how much of it is synthetic material that like you would use and how much of it is like organic material, or how does the material happen?
I'd say similar to, again, 3D printing. There are a lot of similarities. The way material research, material development is an active, ongoing job in many different fields. It's to some extent, it's application driven, which I think you would see in traditional 3D printing. A lot of it's carbon based, but it's not all carbon based. A lot of it comes down to what the end application is. Some of it is electroconductive. Graphene's a popular one to work in for certain electroconductive applications related to bioprinting. A lot of it comes down to the stiffness the mechanical modulus of the material, the compressive modulus, and the tensile modulus, how flexible a material is, how hydrated a material can be. And then a lot of it's coming out of the universities, but they're doing traditional material research, R&D. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're not at bioprinting organs just right away. But if you look at our transition from a 2D petri dish, where traditionally we were doing biological research, to where we started moving into 3D models and started using, essentially, as we were doing that, researchers realized that, hey, these cells that we were playing with in the petri dish, they behave much differently in a 3D model, and they behave much more like they would in the human body than they do in a petri dish. And a lot of that behavior is material dependent. And there are a lot of different types of bios. Collagen's a big one. For the organic ones, stuff like PEGDA, polyethylene glycol, would be one for more of a synthetic material. But anything you can make into a soft, jelly-like material, as long as it's not going to kill cells, people are looking at that for biomaterials. There's a whole different classifications. And then a lot of people will start with a kind of general, like is a general biomaterial, and then they'll add special components to it to make it more suited for certain applications. Bone applications, they're putting a lot of calciums, and hydroxyapatite's a big one. Molecules that will calcify and become stiffer over time as they evolve.
So speaking of applications, it was probably around 2018, I would guess. I was at the Additive Manufacturer User Group show, or AMUG, and I went to a show there, or a presentation, and the presenter at the time, they said that at the time, based on the current trends, they believe that within 10 to 15 years, they'd be able to print a heart. How far off do you think we are? Or have we already?
People will claim to have printed a heart. To some extent, Dustin, me and you have printed hearts. I know, but they haven't worked that well.
Functioning hearts, how's that?
And I always remember the one I used to keep at my desk was rather fragile, and people would always say, "I don't want to break."
I still have mine.
It's okay if you break my heart. I could just print another one.
You guys had so much fun.
But we're getting closer. The heart's an interesting one because it's not the low hanging fruit. We're going to start with tissues before we go to fully functioning organs. It's an easier target to hit, and because the heart, it's not as complicated in its architecture and creation, but to get all those cells to beat in unison with the fidelity required for a heart to never fail over years of use, that's going to take some optimization, shall I say. But other tissue, bone grafts are going to be, to some extent, the metal stuff's already there, but better synthetic materials that, will incorporate into the body. Your body will break it down and bioabsorb it rather than an inert piece of plastic that's going to be stuck there, or metal that's going to be stuck there for the rest of your life. We're seeing a lot more biocompatible materials, bioabsorbable, biodegradable materials, and tissues will be first. And, lab grown meat is a great topic, and that's related to, like, the folks who have muscular dystrophies, like Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, there could be a lot of crosstalk between getting them, essentially a good steak is mostly muscle and some other connective tissue, but getting artificial fibers strong and functional, there will be crosstalk between the lab grown industry and, trying to prevent Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. What are some other applications? The lungs will be one that's, I worked in a pulmonary lab when I was doing my master's in Minnesota, and that's a popular one that they're looking at. But as far as the heart, that's going to be a little bit, but it's coming. And the tricky thing is sometimes, and this again with 3D printing, sometimes you need to look at an application and say, is 3D printing or in our matter bioprinting the proper way to go about doing this? Or is there a different manufacturing or biomanufacturing method that might be more suited to your application? Surely you must have had a talk with a few customers along these lines in the past, Dustin.
Yeah, absolutely. It goes with that same adage of just because you can doesn't mean you should necessarily. So I think that's a fair point. And that's why I kind of ask it, because is that still kind of the industry's initiative to kind of, we'll say, print replacement parts for you, or has it kind of shifted to some extent and saying, well,
No,
maybe we should focus more
it's
over
a
here?
friendly competition.
Okay.
You have multiple parties out, and we're all trying to hit the same goal, but you're all trying to help people and increase their quality of life. And no, as long as the target hasn't been solved yet, it's just friendly banter and competition. But you have different classes, and like take the heart, for example, or any tissue. You could start from nothing and try bioprinting it, or you can take an organ and hit it with some soaps and detergents, which will rupture the cells, and you can rinse all the cells out of an organ, and you're left with, the White Walker protein matrix that still resembles an organoid and benefits a lot of function to those cells, that then you could seed cells on there, let them perforate through this sponge-like looking material. That's all your protein structure, and repopulate that. Miromatrix in Minnesota would be a good example of a company doing something like this. They have a lot of products in their pipeline that look at liver and kidney function along these lines. Decell an organ from either a donor or an animal and recellularizing it with human tissue. And are they going to make a kidney prior to the bioprinters making a kidney? I think it's a friendly competition, because at the end of the day, the one who gets it first, it's better for the patient, or ideally better for the patient, or who could make them the best product. Maybe one group would get there first. Maybe the other group could make a better product. But it's good to have that competition, because it's going to lead to better treatments for a variety of different disease physiologies out there.
So with the comment that you said, who can get there first? So getting there is one thing, right? But like you mentioned at the beginning, don't be like Paulo. How much testing has to happen once you kind of have printed something that you want? I mean, you have to go through some sort of regulations, right? So once an organ has been printed, what happens? I mean, someone prints it, how much testing has to happen? I guess it kind of depends on what part of the body it might be, or could you shed a little bit of light on maybe some of the regulation side of it?
Yeah, and that's a whole nother segue. And making an object is one thing, and then your go-to-market strategy is where this kind of comes into play. There's a big regulator in between you and the market for justifiable reasons, but ideally you want to organize your pathway to be regulator friendly. And to some extent, that's so like my PhD application, we would 3D print with biocompatible, bioabsorbable materials, and we would add even more biocompatible materials onto that scaffold. And then we would seed it with human bone marrow derived stem cells. And the reason we were doing this all in a lab, benchtop science. And the reason we weren't bioprinting with cells directly is because we were looking at the regulator, and essentially we were creating a medical product, but we were planning on using the patient's own cells. Essentially, say you had bad cartilage, the surgeon would go in, they would scrape away the bad cartilage in one of your major articular joints, your knee, your hip, your shoulder. So they would clean up the wound, because your cartilage is not going to repair itself. It's incapable in that articular cartilage. So the surgeon would scrape away the bad cartilage, and then they would drill down to your subchondral bone, and they would release your patient-specific, it's your own cells, release you from your bone marrow. And then we have this mechanically reinforced, bioactive material that we would then anchor down and suture down into that defect region that the surgeon cleaned up. And then it's kind of like a sponge that would suck up the cells, and it's your own cells. and then they'll differentiate into chondrocytes, which will create new cartilage. But that's an easier regulatory pathway than using cells, or, I would have to take cells from Dustin and then convince the regulators that I should inject them into Justin. And, the regulator would have a much more questions about those. Whereas if I'm using the patient's cells and putting them back into the patient's body, they're not going to reject it. Whereas a cell source that's not from the patient, allogeneic cell source, you run the risk of host first graft disease where your body rejects it and your immune system fights it off. And whatever you bioprint and put in that patient, their body's going to attack it because they see it as foreign tissue.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But to bring up, it's in the regulators are just doing their job. And if they're not there, you have folks like Paolo Macchiarini, who is 3D printing something, a trachea that he claims. They don't extensively characterize it and validate that it's working. And they just start implanting it into patients, and he's killing all his patients. The only one of his patients who survived was the one patient who removed the trachea out. And every other patient, to my knowledge, died, fortunately. And it's really sad because not all of these patients needed these procedures. They could have survived. It wasn't like a life or death thing where they had to get it. Some of them could. It wouldn't have been like the 100% ideal life. They had a trachea damage, but they were surviving on it on their own, and they didn't need a replacement trachea.
Yeah, watching it was like mind-blowing to me, right? It was just, well, at first I didn't know what I was getting into, and then it was like, oh my gosh. And it's just like, wow, how does something like that happen, And I from my perspective, from public view, is like people read a little bit, you get a little bit of highlights of, oh, we printed some cartilage, where we did this in bioprinting, but I feel like it's high level stuff on the surface that people are kind of interested. Like Dustin asked about an organ. It's just, there's probably so much more that you've already sort of discussed, and more beyond that's actually happening that gets you to that point. And then you see something like that happen, and it's like, oh my gosh, it almost it makes me question, like, why are we printing? Or, and that's why I asked the regulation question, like, what's the proper procedure, and how could, why should something like that happen, or not happen?
Yeah, and there's a few ways. There's a few routes to market. And essentially, if there's a carve out, there's a niche route for small off, not big batch sizes of medical products. If someone's in a life or death situation, a surgeon has a little bit of flexibility to try a new innovative device or procedure, but it's not like that surgeon can open up a clinic and do that new novel device day in and day out without having a clinical trial. So that's one aspect of it. But if you want to do something, and that's to orthopedics would be an area that's started into, and orthopedics is a changing landscape because of that, or kind of because of 3D printing and how easy it is to change a design with 3D printing and additive manufacturing. You've seen this a lot in the metal, with Stryker, big metal printing companies like that, with the replacement joints that they're making, the hips, the pelvis, and they're tailoring it for a more patient-specific fit. I know the Hospital of Special Surgeries out in Manhattan was big on that, and kind of, dare I say, challenging the FDA's rule of what kind of procedures you had to go through to bring a new device to market. And essentially, HSS was saying they validate their materials and they validate their manufacturing process. And if they want to make a small change, to better, you're talking about changing an implant so that it would fit a patient better. It's not a major change. And they wanted some leniency and some leeway to make a more personalized product. But once you make, like, and I'm not an expert totally on the regulation, so you might have to check this. It's like once you make more than 5, it's like 4 or 5, you go into a different purview of the FDA. You can get away with it a handful of times, but if you start doing that too much, the FDA will come after you for not having a licensed product. They're going to say all these new products that you have, they're not licensed. You can't be doing that. But that landscape is starting to change with metal 3D printers in particular. But for the biological material, the more softer biocompatible materials, and using cells, there's a lot of animal preclinical trials going on. And initially, we designed something in the lab. We tested it out on the bench. You might have a 3D model system in vitro on the bench top. And then typically we're still using animal models to test out our new products. AI is coming into the mix a little bit. They want to reduce the amount of animal trials that are needed, which is, understandable for many reasons. But at the same time, we still need those animal models because the AI system isn't perfect. And then once you're seeing good progress in the animal models, then you start going into first in human. You start doing your clinical trials, just like you would most other regulatory pathways with the FDA, like similar to a medical device.
Awesome. So when you say AI trials, is that just like simulating it within a software?
Yeah, essentially simulating it. And again, if we're using a bone scaffold, out of a softer biological material, not a metal one, something that's supposed to absorb into your body or be biodegradable, you might want to change the parameters, the thickness of your struts, the molecular weight of the polymers that you're using to make it stiffer or softer in some areas. And depending how smart you are, you got to be way smarter than me to understand some of these mechanical forces that are going to come from all different directions and your application, your manufacturing process of that biomaterial, how it will hold up in these different scenarios. It's kind of like a generative design, and it's a feedback loop between designing something, testing it, analyzing the data, and then making a change to your model, testing it. And it's a feedback loop. And the AI can help with that a lot. But there's also a lot of unknowns. And currently, animal models are still preclinical models, kind of tested in an animal system, and then go on to human trials from there. Starting small with the human trials, you do a safety run, and then you start looking at efficacy. You scale up your trials as you go and gain success and momentum.
Wow.
And now it's time for Layers of Information.
So I want to take just a slightly different track here for a second. So Michael, like I mentioned before, we haven't talked very much for a while, and you've been deep into this stuff, obviously. So without naming names, what would you say are some of the most innovative applications that you're coming across or you're hearing about in this space? And when you talk about it, try to keep it in like the layman's terms, because not everyone has been studying this stuff quite like you have, obviously.
That's tough. And I always get excited by the functional stuff. And even me in 3D saying, you could design something that looked cool and I could appreciate it. But I always liked the stuff that maybe didn't look as cool, but it was functional and it worked really well. That's what I see myself catching the attention. And what's going to work well in bioprinting?
Or what are you finding that's exciting that you're reading about and that is like, wow, that's a really cool approach, or that's interesting, or I never thought about that perspective?
Yeah, it doesn't have to work yet.
Yeah.
I would say like in general, our understanding of biomaterials is getting much better, much quicker, like at an exponential rate. And and some material properties, you look at stuff, but then it's our architecture and how we organize those. We're not just using a solid block of collagen. We're creating a microporous architecture, and that's tunable, and how we tune that, like our manufacturing parameters, how those influence our outcomes at the end, and then our feedback loop that we're learning from those. I find that very interesting, and it's quickly broadening. Like once, I wouldn't say it's an issue, but it's, it needed to be addressed. And we're learning a lot about these biological materials, how cells how the biological materials behave when we put them in these weird shapes and geometries, but then how cells and tissues and our bodies interact with them. We're learning a lot about that. And we're going to see, a lot of changes coming from that, a lot of regenerative medicine and how we get people to heal quickly and faster. It's going to be exciting.
So is this just because we have more processing power and big data, or is this because there have been more recent studies on this subject?
But I think more so the second option, and
Okay.
people are doing the studies and looking at them now. Before there wasn't interest, there wasn't as much funding. Everything was in 2D. Like 2D biomaterial is pretty straightforward to quantify. Part of it is the multidisciplinary aspect of this. The biologists weren't always hanging out with the mechanical engineers and the software programmers. People are finally starting to look at these in these core research facilities where you'd have all these different disciplines that are hanging out together and working collaboratively together. That was kind of novel. It took a few years for these different institutions and centers to this doesn't happen overnight, and these funding pipelines to open up to do this research, this multidisciplinary research, and the worldwide collaboration has been great, because researchers from all over the world, they could identify some of the issues, some of the boundaries to progress, but there was a lot of work to be done. And identifying the issue is one thing, but then going through and doing all the science, the rigorous science, to go around and characterize these, and to do it in a way where you could compare it to people over in Japan and Australia and Brazil, apples to apples, oranges to oranges. It took a while, but we're getting there. And a lot of these facilities are set up and they're doing great work now. And because of, those struggles early on, we're making a lot of progress. And I'd be hesitant to say progress, but our understanding of these biomaterials is accelerating so quickly. And because we have such a greater understanding, the progress then will be shortly coming. And we are making progress, just to clear, but it'll be accelerating.
Okay. So then, just looking forward a little bit, from an application standpoint or an innovation standpoint, however you want to take this, but what do you think will be the next breakthrough application or breakthrough moment for 4D printing or printing in cells, or however you want to classify it? And why do you think it hasn't happened yet?
Ooh, that's tough. It's let me get my bingo board and what's the Mr. What do I have on bingo? But is it the retina, like the corneal transplants in the eye? Is it the patient tailored orthopedic hips and knees? I like these bioabsorbable rather than the metal materials. The softer, the bioabsorbable. They'll say you're a young child and you have a big orthopedic, issue. I'd rather put something that's going to dissolve away in a body over time. You're putting in a scaffolding structure that your cell is going to incorporate and grow into. And ultimately, that scaffold that we put in there will dissolve over time, and you'll be left with only the patient's body parts there. I like that more, especially for a younger patient that's growing still, has room to grow, than, an orthopedic application where you're completely cutting out human tissue and replacing it with metal tissue that will be there forever, can never change shape or size, can't grow with the patient, will loosen up over time and kind of fall out over 15, 20 years potentially. These softer biomaterials have a lot of potential for that. I find that exciting. And then functional. There's different things, like just because it looked one way when it, the way we humans create something, we might have a biosynth product that we end up implanting into patients that doesn't quite look what the original organ or tissue does, but it might serve in the same function. Diabetes is a good one where the pancreas, your beta cells, which produce insulin, are in the pancreas. And if you have issues with your pancreas, you might want a new pancreas. But a bioprinted pancreas might not exactly look like a normal pancreas. But if your end goal is to have a tissue that can sense your blood sugar and produce insulin accordingly, do you care if it looks like the original pancreas, or do you care if it's able to regulate your insulin levels so you're no longer diabetic? That's curious to me too. If you can get the function and it doesn't quite match up with the previous form, but is that okay? Is that not okay? There's different applications where, orthopedics, you want it to kind of look the same, and you could potentially be superhuman, Can we over-engineer something, and can we give you super abilities better than what you had previously?
What problem are you trying to solve?
Yep. Yeah, for sure. Our last episode was very similar in the sense of like, does it need to look a certain way, and in order for it to function? And a lot of times it's like it doesn't really need to be the most beautiful thing ever. It just needs to work.
I'm always attracted to the functional applications. It could be overly complex or it could be really simple, but if it works, I like the simple application. If it works well, if it's reliable, it makes me smile.
Yep, I would agree with you on that one. So what inspires you? What do you think that, what's going to be the next thing that you want to push towards within your work that you do every day? What gets you excited?
Oh, what gets me out of bed in the morning, huh? In the past, I was fortunate enough to be in the right place at the right time and have the right skill set, and not everyone else was looking to do the applications that I wanted. And I was concerned that no one would if I didn't get up and contribute and, help drive the needle forward. Now there's definitely more momentum in the industry. So I wouldn't say that's my biggest motivating factor. But ultimately, we want to help someone, patients and people, whether it's the lab grown meat and you're preventing people from starving, or you're trying to make a new pancreas so there's not as many diabetics in the world. Ultimately, you're using your applications and skill sets and efforts to try and help people. And I find that to be really rewarding. But you got to be sober about that. We're not going to print a bioprinted heart overnight that's going to be functional for more than a 10-year reliability lifespan. So, you got to be okay with a little bit of slow progress. We'll get there over time. But, making progress, unlocking new applications, like the field is still growing and growing, and we're still finding new ways of making things, and technology is getting better. The biomaterials are getting better. Our resolution that we can achieve with these biomaterials used to be a little messy. They didn't like to hold their shape as much, but we're getting better ways of manufacturing and increasing our resolution. We're still making progress.
So just to expand on that a little bit, because I'm sure we have a number of people listening in that are maybe looking to get into the industry or, grow into the industry. And given that, my network of people in this space is pretty small. You're the guy, for me at least, in this space. If someone was trying to get into the bioprinting space, from your perspective right now, what kind of skills or experiences or certifications do you think that they would need to be successful, and why?
You just need a great attitude.
Come on.
Sign me up.
Seriously, nothing. Like, if you want to get involved, you can get involved. The barriers of entry are like dropping rapidly. And like when I wanted to get into it, I was just you got to be a little aggressive. And I had a 4-year degree when I started looking at bioprinting. But that wasn't enough. You needed a PhD if you wanted to actually lead any applications. And getting into a PhD program, like I couldn't get into a PhD program. And I just started reading these science review papers initially to understand the field, what I could, and kind of see where the limitations of the field at the time were. And then I'd start emailing the authors of the paper. And, whenever you reach out to a scientist and you're like, hey, I read your paper, to some extent, like they love hearing that. They're happy that people are reading their work. And you just it's almost like cold calling. I was cold calling these professors saying like, I have this knowledge of 3D printing and this eagerness to get into bioprinting. And I know a little bit about biology. I see you're working in XYZ. I find that really fascinating. Do you have any, room for me to volunteer? I mean, I was looking at volunteering. I wasn't even, I tried volunteering in some labs and I was still getting shut down.
Wow. Wow.
But, just don't give up. And the attitude of the individuals is super important. In biology, you're going to, your experiments aren't always going to work. There is a large amount of failure, and you have to stay optimistic. And, it's a lot of hard work. But if you're eager and willing to do the work and you express genuine interest and like the wanting to, it's okay that you're not an expert right away. But if you're willing to learn and eager to learn, there will be people out there who will be willing to give you a shot.
Great advice. So with bioprinting, one last question from me. Where are you're talking about different scientists and for me, my mind like frames around like it could be Stratasys, it could be 3D Systems on the polymer side. Like who is the company or three companies that you think are the ones to work for? Or is it just an individual?
Oh, geez, you're going to get me in trouble with that one. I know a lot of the founders and folks at these companies. I've caused issues in the past in public comments about company A, and then their competitor, company B, is calling me up the next day. And
We're not saying any of them are better than others, just ones that
and similar, it's just a friendly competition. I try and stay agnostic. I like to see the whole industry progress, and it's a small, I was always surprised by how small of a community it is. And even worldwide, it's, and that's another reason to be genuine. And if you're willing to work hard and like push the needle, there are companies all over the world who are great work opportunities. And a lot of the innovate, the bigger the company is, dare I say, the less innovative they would be. The smaller companies are where you're seeing a lot of the innovation, and then they may get acquired by the bigger companies, once they kind of start posing a competitive risk to the bigger companies. There have been a lot of acquisitions over the last 5 years of predominantly biomaterial companies. And I know a few biomaterial companies that sell 3D printers almost as a venue for selling their biomaterials, or at least that's how they got into the industry.
So then just to kind of ask that a different way, I mean, I haven't done any research, but last I heard Organovo is kind of the lead company in this space. Are there other strong competitors that are out there kind of competing now with Organovo?
Might get them in trouble.
I would say
so. Maybe a better way to say it is if I wanted to research it, where's the one place to go to learn them all?
Yeah.
Oh, geez. I don't, and 3D Systems was doing good stuff, and I'll give them credit because they were making large investments into bioprinting, to some extent. And Dustin, I'm sure you can confirm this. Some of the larger 3D printing companies were hesitant of investing in bioprinting as a serious investment in like R&D pipeline. But I do give 3D Systems one for investing, and their technology platform was very compatible with it as well. But, it's not just Organovo, and what's Dimension Inc. out in Chicago. They recently got a FDA approval for some sort of trial for their bone material. And a lot of it's biomaterial. So I wouldn't say it's the hardware companies driving it. I would say it's the biomaterial companies driving it, and then, they're application specific. So there's really a flat playing ground, I guess. The different medical applications require different biomaterials, and there's like a bunch of different little niches that you could be in. And there's it's not a direct head-to-head competition because one biomaterial will be better suited for one application, and a
Yeah.
different biomaterial is better suited for another application. So there's plenty of room for to hedge your bets, for plenty of companies to make progress in this space.
Okay. So then, again, thinking of our audience here, for maybe some of the newer people or maybe the more experienced people, from your perspective, Mike, what do you think is one top-notch resource that you think everyone should know about in this space? It could be a course, it could be a magazine, it could be an article. I mean, what kind of comes to mind? What are you reading? Where are you getting your information?
Oh, geez. I don't know if I should say this, but Sci-Hub, the online database that lets you download academic articles.
Huh.
I remember until I was in academia after working at Stratus. It was different if you're not in academia to read cutting edge advances in the field with it's hard to get the academic literature, the scientific articles. If you're not part of an institution, a lot of times it might be like $30 to $50 per article if you want to download it. And that's very cost prohibitive for a lot of young, eager people who want to look at the cutting edge advancements or get a better understanding of the field. There's a lot of review articles. That's a great place to start. And then if you find an application or a subfield that you like, you can drill down deeper. But I love reading scientific review articles because they set a nice landscape, and then you could tune in your attention from there. And they'll have references, skimming through the references at the end of the scientific articles is where you're going to find more relevant topics. And that's where you're going to notice where the labs are. There's certain labs around the world, and there's a bunch of them now, but different labs have their different expertise, and there's hotbed zones. I'm sure Boston has plenty of great bioprinting companies out there, Dustin. But you start reading, okay, where in the world are these people cranking out these applications? Australia has a lot of acoustic, like 3D, 4D printing, where they're using sound waves to move the cells around.
Cool.
With the biomaterials. But it's kind of goofy that that's not as popular in other parts of the world. There's, Melbourne, Australia and Wollongong, Australia are coming out with those. But through reading these review papers and other scientific articles, that's where you can see where the cutting edge facilities are. And if you're looking to get, into academia or learn more about it, those are great places to network. That's what I did. When I was trying to get in, I read a lot of scientific articles, and then I was, emailing the professors from the articles that I was reading, trying to learn more, seeing if they had opportunities in their lab. If they didn't, did they know like other people, in related fields that would have opportunities in their labs, and then just networking from there.
Wow,
that's great advice.
So one last thing, I know we've been asking a lot of the questions, but is there anything that's kind of come to your mind that you want to make sure to talk about or hit on or mention?
Oh, no, the expectations. It's good to have modest expectations. And Dustin, when we were working back in 2014 was it 2017 you left or
Yep.
late? We went through a hype peak with 3D printing where they thought everyone, you're not going to use a dishwasher to wash your coffee cup. You're just going to 3D print a coffee cup and everyone's going to have one. And that expectation fell down. There was loss of confidence in the industry a little bit, but it's to some extent people just had slightly unrealistic expectations of how quickly things were going to change. And bioprinting is sort of like that. People are wondering, oh, you haven't 3D printed a working heart yet. It's been so many years now. What are you guys doing over there?
Try it out
But
yourself and see what happens.
you got to balance that with the Palo Macaroni story. Be like, well, when we move too quickly, people start dying. If we'll get to the heart, but there's a lot of material R&D science that has been going on in the background, but it's really in standardizations to get the academics from around the world all on the same page with how they're designing their assays and characterizing their biomaterials so that you can make references from one scientist's study to a different one and it's comparable. We're really starting to get on the same page, and that things will accelerate, but it'll take some time still. We got to go through the proper trials, the regulatory approvals, the process. We really got to vet this stuff out if we want to do it in a safe way, which can be frustrating at times. Some people are anxious. I get it. Life's short, but we're making progress. Hang in there.
That's a great point. From what you just said, it's like the excitement of wanting to drive an industry further and getting everybody on the same page. I mean, Dustin and I face that a lot since we do a lot of work in orthotics and prosthetics, and it's a similar situation. And it's like, how are you going to test this? What's the proper way to test this? And if we are going to get this adopted, which some of it has, how do we make sure that there's some cohesiveness to what everybody's doing so it is safe and that you're not going too fast, even though it seems like it's been a long time. In retrospect, it's moving very quickly, and it seems like the same thing with the field that you're in.
Definitely. And don't get me wrong, there's still a little bit of the wild, wild west in the industry. There aren't always laws in place. Sometimes we're beating the laws, so there just aren't laws to regulate certain spaces. And we kind of have to act as adults, but with the best interests of some patients. There was another topic that just slipped my mind. The onyx you mentioned.
Well,
yeah,
it makes me think of 3D printing firearms. That was way out in front, and that came out almost 10 years ago now, and now we're just starting to see legislation around it, or at least I am in the state that I live in, where they're talking about ghost firearms and 3D printed devices and stuff like that. And so it's a big machine. It takes a long time to kind of get up to speed on things.
Yeah, I agree. And, time will tell. Hopefully there's not too many tragic stories. Hopefully there's more happy endings. And, in general, I think this industry will help a lot of people. There might be a few speed bumps along the way, a few bad apples. But in general, I think this industry poses more of a benefit to humanity than a risk.
Yeah. Don't let a few mistakes define an entire industry, for sure. Okay. Do you have any other questions for Dustin and I that you would want to know, since you've kind of been out of the polymer space, or maybe you still follow it, or?
No. What are you most excited about in the next year and then next long term in 3D printing?
For me, what I'm seeing is the digital workflow is starting to consolidate. And what I mean by that is in the past and still currently, sometimes, let's say you're scanning something. I mean, we'll talk orthotics and prosthetics. To be able to scan, say, your wrist, clean up the data from the scan, actually create a device for like a wrist orthosis, and then print it and finish it. Each one of those steps were usually disjointed, made by a different company, didn't talk to each other, and you had to, kind of become a specialist in each thing. And what I'm seeing now, and for the people who are using it, they'll say it's going too slow, but to Justin's point, it's moving pretty fast. A lot of these different systems and workflows are starting to talk with each other and work with each other all in one seamless way. And so I think that's not only going to help just that space, but so many other spaces. And so it gets me excited because then that makes it accessible to a lot of other people. And further, I think of like the new Apple Vision goggles that are coming out tomorrow, I believe. In fact, you can start buying them or at least seeing them in the stores. I believe that that will start to unlock design and CAD capabilities, so that you don't need to be, and I say this in the most endearing way, but a CAD monkey to be able to make the most beautiful design. I don't know for sure, but I would imagine you could maybe make it with your hands or something like that by wearing goggles, which makes it so much more accessible.
And that's great to hear you say that because, I think you had more of a CAD background than I did. I came in with a biology degree when I started 3D printing. And, I worked with Chris and he was a CAD monkey.
He's a wizard.
And, I got into doing the MRIs and the CT scans.
Yep.
And back in those days, I would hop around through 8 different programs as I'm taking a patient DICOM series and adjusting it and scanning it and thresholding and cleaning it up. Cleaning it up might take me days just to clean it up.
In Versailles.
So yeah, and this, a great Portuguese, Brazilian software. But that's, it's great to hear that they're unifying. And I got into that because I didn't have the CAD skill, but I knew that MRIs were accurate at measuring things. And, I was interested in making anatomical models. And one final thought, I remembered what I forgot earlier. We didn't talk much about it, but dentistry. Dentists is where you'll see some of the biggest innovations in bioprinting because they're already experimenting with the biological materials, and they kind of have a weird little niche cut out with the regulatory industry and the regulators. And the way that a lot of dentists are small private practices compared to larger hospitals, which are more centralized in their ownership, the dentists will drive innovation. And I think we'll see a lot of cool biomaterial, cool applications, and that'll be a foyer for other applications using similar biomaterials, biocompatible, bioabsorbable, cell-based materials. So I'd keep an eye on the dentistry space is what I'm saying.
Well, that's really interesting you say that because I just read, I think it was last week or last month, that they successfully regrew teeth in the lab where it can self-repair. Have you heard about this at all?
Back in 2010, I remember reading a paper. It wasn't bioprinting, but they were taking cells from your teeth region, periodontal ligament stem cells, and seeding them on scaffolds, microporous scaffolds that were shaped as a tooth.
Wow.
And this was big back then, like 2009, 2000, but it was very promising technology back then. So I wouldn't be the least bit surprised to hear that it's progressed quite a ways since then. And I believe it. Then you put it in one of the best incubators, which would be the human body, and let those cells that already have the genetic programming do what they do and function as teeth. But then also, dentistry is going to be big because there's a lot of demanding forces in there. There's a lot of bacteria in there. Like it's not a very clean environment. You're putting a lot of mechanical load under it. You need stiff materials.
I think we lost you for a second.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
There you go.
I was just saying dentistry. They're gonna drive it forward. Stiff materials, a lot of bacteria in there. It's a harsh environment. They're gonna make some great stuff though.
Really cool. Wow.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll wind it down here. It's been. I have to thank you. This has been really a pleasure to learn from the things that you spoke about today. I feel like I have to call you on a regular basis now to learn more. I'm not so sure I'm going to go find all the academic papers and read through.
Well, that's fine. I'm going to be following this podcast closely now, and I'm excited to see all your episodes. And this is how I'm going to be keeping tabs on the ever broadening industry of 3D printing. It's a mountain to keep up on all the innovations, but it's great to catch up with individuals like yourselves who know a good bit about it. And as Dustin knows, I'm always happy to talk about bioprinting. So feel free to reach out whenever.
Yeah, we most certainly will, or I will for sure.
Yep.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, Michael, for joining us.
And Dustin.
But yeah, thank you again for joining us, and to everybody who's listening, we'll see you next time, and hope you enjoyed this episode. Thanks for listening, and if you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest from AM Insider, you can follow us on LinkedIn at AM Insider or send us an email at justin@aminsider.org or dustin@aminsider.org. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.